This is straightforward, although it's likely there's still ways of complicating this conversation unnecessarily. That is because we tend to make the logical mistake of confusing that which is simple for that which is easy. We use those terms interchangeably, and perhaps there's merit to that. But for the purposes of this discussion, we have to highlight the subtle differences between the two so that we can have the correct bearings. That which is simple in this discussion means having to do with the basic elements that comprise a concept. The building blocks of anything, those foundational components of an idea. While easy, on the other hand, refers to that which is comfortable to engage. This topic is not going to be particularly fun to discuss, so in that sense, it's not easy. But it is simple in that it's built upon fairly foundational concepts of both logical and even emotional reasoning. Again, the reason I'm making this clear is because when you wrestle with this topic in your mind after you watch the video, you should know it's not because I've overburdened your thoughts with ridiculous complexities. It's because it's not cozy. Or at least that's my humble estimation as to why you might struggle with something so rudimentary. It's because this is simple, but it's not easy. So, African leaders are traumatized. But what is trauma? Trauma, for the purposes of this discussion, is physical and or psychological symptoms to a violent experience. The way I see it, you cannot truly appreciate how brutal and dehumanizing the colonial project has been, and some of its offsprings, such as the Apartheid government, without also acknowledging the damage this must have had on the minds of those who directly suffered under these systems. If, for instance, apartheid really was the monster they claim it was, and it was, then these liberators must have suffered deep mental and psychic injuries that leave most of them cripplingly unfit for leadership. And apartheid really was that bad. It was no joke, especially if you were fighting against it. So why have they not stepped back to heal from it as they advise here and there and impart wisdom as they are solicited? When soldiers go to war, most of them come back unfit for civilian life, let alone leadership of the country. Most soldiers suffer from depression, paranoia, post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, etc. You cannot be expected to lead a country and all its diverse people with such a formerly isolated and tortured mind. Now, mind you, I said most. There are, of course, some capable exceptions. But here in Africa, we pretend as if every single soldier in that fight for liberation is that rare exception, when that is impossible by definition. Oh, and while we are on the South African contextual landscape, I just want to make it clear that I'm not just referring to the black leadership alone, the black elders. No. This is about to get interesting. What about, I'm thinking of picking something a little less contentious. Indian leadership. What does the world understand in relationship to Indian leadership as far as the liberation struggle is concerned? Who's the most famous example we can think of? Let me just try to reach into my mind and get to the depths of... It's Ghandi. It's Ghandi, obviously. Ghandi spent some time in South Africa, didn't he? What did he do when he was here? He decried that he, as an Indian, had to be treated by the apartheid government the same way they were treating black people. The problem there, for him, was not that they were treating black people poorly. They were treating him, as an Indian man, like black people, who he even referred to using the K word, which is the South African version of the N word that's much more internationally recognized. Oopsie daisy! So what does that mean for the character of Indian moral and political leadership in South Africa? What does it mean when the entire world reveres and venerates this character that is associated with your culture? But here in South Africa, your home, he's kind of a diasporic nightmare, if anybody looks closely enough. How do you attempt to reconcile those two things? You are torn asunder in your moral and political consciousness, almost like some kind of trauma, which none of the generations before ours has ever confronted. But what about the other prominent aspect of the Indian community, the Muslim tradition? Ahmed Kathrada? Surely there's no trauma there. Well, that aforementioned K-word comes from the Islamic tradition. Now, I have to stress that it's a hateful misappropriation, okay? The word, in its most innocent form, is supposed to suggest a non-believer. But still, what is the function of such a term in a South Africa that is, for one thing, a secular state, which is to say, governed with the assumption of non-belief, which, by the way, is the only way to secure the diverse religious rights and freedoms we enjoy in this country, and is also made up of a predominantly black leadership. That double function of the term applies to the extent that digesting this stuff separately is morally and politically quite a task. The contribution of Islamic lexicon in South Africa's most hateful terminology is a trauma, a spiritual trauma that is yet to be digested adequately. Perhaps the black Muslims might begin the digestive process of that reality, but those will probably be members of our generation and the generations that follows the liberation generation, at least predominantly. So again, it's a trauma which the elders have not confronted, because it's not easy. What about the colored community? Well, you know, the constant battle of juggling the reality that you didn't have it quite as bad as the blacks, but you also didn't have it quite as good as the whites. When you cry over there, they say, check your privilege. When you cry over there, they say, you're not our concern anymore. Or when they do try to extend a shared concern, it's on the basis of Afrikaans. And Afrikaans is the thing that the massacre of students in Soweto, June 16, was all about. So, trauma, undigested, unprocessed trauma. Meanwhile, a kid with Down syndrome in your neighborhood was gunned down, not by a gangster or some nefarious element like that, but by a cop. So who do you complain to and when? What's the timetable for when you're supposed to get housing? Oh, and by the way, when do you get to ask for some land? Most diverse community with Bantu ancestry, German ancestry, English ancestry, Dutch, San ancestry, probably etc., which the older generations, again, have not dealt with and are likely not going to, because they don't even appreciate that they're functioning under this influence. And what about the whites? Oh man, here we go. There's this strong emphasis on ancestry and history, and yet, you know, the history is kind of too apartheidy for everybody's taste. But hey, the Boer thinks all the black people get to spiritually connect with their ancestors, even though those ancestors, having been human, means that they were not perfect. Why can't we then connect with our ancestors, even understanding that, sure, they had some imperfections, we can admit that, but also still connect with the legacy that they left behind? And why do they get to do that, but we don't? That's double standards. So there's this constant back and forth that's an angst fest about what you get to do and keep, and what parts of your history you get to embrace and what you don't, and what that means in the overall landscape of your spirituality and your understanding, your identity. And what it is it's trauma. Unprocessed trauma. And I'll just leave it at that. Oh, what about the English? The English can go screw themselves. Nobody invites them to anything. They don't have any friends. Well, except maybe the Canadians. But the Canadians are everyone's friend, generally. So it's not really an achievement. Everybody remembers the red coats, but nobody loves them. I'm joking, of course. These leaders are traumatized. Zuma is calling everybody Stratcom. That's because the man is paranoid. He's seeing them all over the place. Who could blame him? He's been through a lot, you know? They hoard money like they're afraid it's gonna disappear tomorrow. This is signs of abused minds, people. And we, the newer generations, have to give these old people their much needed and well-deserved rest. Not because we hate them, but because we care for them and their mental and spiritual and psychic health. Now, I know there's a bit of irony in my delivery of this thing, but I'm really sincere about this trauma theory. I've put some links in the description for things similar to this discussion. You can read up on it afterwards and yeah, basically figure it out for yourself.